In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. There is something specifically about our Orthodox faith that you have to understand. We spend quite a bit of time as the Coptic Church speaking of the saints, and we venerate the saints, and we build churches in the name of the saints, and every single one of us have saints pictures in their wallet. We love saints. As a Coptic culture, we absolutely love them. As a matter of fact, we love saints so much that there's a saint for every specific possible situation in your life. You ask your mother and she will tell you. There's a saint for if you lose your keys. There is a saint for if you need help with your exams. There is a saint for if ever you wake up and you have a headache. If you need to go see a dentist, there's a specific saint. There's a saint for every specific thing that can possibly happen in your life. We love saints, but I have to be honest with you. There's a few saints that we're supposed to be able to hold up to a certain priority that we don't do a very good job with. And these are what the Orthodox Church considers to be the patristic saints, the patristic fathers. I mean, you have to understand something. When we speak about our orthodoxy and when we speak about where we get the ideas that we have within our faith, you have to understand that we follow a very important three-step rule. The Orthodox Church teaches us what? What we believe as a faith was given to us by Christ, was taught by the apostles, and was kept by the fathers. So again, anything and everything we know about our theology, anything and everything we know about our faith, was given and revealed to us by Christ, was taught by the apostles, and was kept by the fathers. So who are the fathers? Who are the fathers? There could be a very long debate as who's considered to be a father, who's considered to be just a saint, who's considered to be just a scholar. What I want you to know is that over the next semester, I would tell you, probably this entire term, as much as possible, anybody and everybody who will be invited to come and share with you guys will make reference to this notion of the patristic fathers. So today I thought I would introduce you to one that many of us know by name, but sadly we don't know really his story. And this is St. Gregory the Theologian. What we know of St. Gregory the Theologian is what? That he wrote what? The Liturgy of St. Gregory. You know that liturgy that Abuna prays usually on Christmas and on Easter? It's a really long one that you really hope you'll be able to daydream through so that when you do finally get back to your senses, it's time for communion. He wrote that really long liturgy. Now here's the thing. Among those who are called theologians in the church, there's only 3 people that we recognize who have that title officially. Does anybody know what the word theologian even means? It's not exactly knowledge. It's vision of God. Him who has seen God. Now, this notion of theologian is given traditionally to 3 people in the church. The first one who has ever been given this title is St. John the Beloved. Why did we give him the notion of theologian? Well, if you read Revelation, you clearly see that he has seen and has been exposed to something nobody else has seen. So they call him what? One who has seen God, a theologian. St. Gregory of Nazianzus, or St. Gregory the theologian, is the second. And the third one is called St. Simon. And we'll talk about him a little bit later. He's also one of the patristic fathers. So today I want to introduce you to St. Gregory. What's amazing about St. Gregory, he is nothing like the rest of the fathers. His character is actually very different. So what do we need to know about St. Gregory? St. Gregory is born in the 4th century, 329 AD. He's born in an area called Nazianzus in Cappadocia. What is Cappadocia? You'll hear often about this notion of what? The Cappadocian Fathers. This is where you have Turkey today. So it's somewhere along the lines of the Middle East and Asia, and it embodies a certain few cities. Now, specifically when we speak about Cappadocia, we're always talking about modern-day Turkey. So he happens to be from Cappadocia. He has Greek parents. His mother, who is a saint, is called Saint Nona, and he comes from a very, very special family. Very. His father happens to be the bishop of an area called Nazianzus. And his father's name is Gregory. And people are often mistaken the both of them. Because one of them is St. Gregory the Great, which is his father, right? And you have St. Gregory of Nazianzus, who is basically his son. But the problem is that both of them were bishop of Nazianzus, the city. So it causes some confusion, and we'll explain why this caused confusion in a second. His father converted to Christianity before he was born. His father was actually pagan to a certain extent. And this is going to be very important for when we talk about his story, because his father wasn't exactly born into the faith. So because he didn't exactly know everything there was to know about the faith, his father kind of messed up along the way when he was teaching. And we'll see how that's important. His father becomes Bishop Gregory, the elder of Nazianzus. Brother is Caesarius of Nazianzus. Now, his brother happens to be extremely, extremely educated, to the extent where he becomes almost like the right-hand physician of the emperor. And we know later that his brother lived a very righteous life. And he studies rhetoric and philosophy in some of the most key areas in the 4th century. He studies rhetoric and philosophy in Nazianzus, in Caesarea, in Alexandria, and finally in Athens. Does anybody know what rhetoric is? So rhetoric is almost the art of speaking, right? It's being able to speak publicly, but in a way where you can debate, in a way where you are extremely convincing, it's extremely poetic, and rhetoric is a study in and of itself. Oftentimes today, rhetoric is very much tied into the notion of studying law. Because if you will be a lawyer who stands in court and be able to speak on behalf of other people, that notion of rhetoric is extremely important. And he studied both rhetoric and philosophy, and not to mention the faith, in 4 very key places in the world during the time where this was the hub of everything that was happening educationally in the world. In Nazianzus, Caesarea, Alexandria, and Athens. Now there's some key things that you have to know about his life before we actually get into the details of him becoming this known Christian, this known bishop. At some point, he is traveling from one place to another, he's on a ship, and there's a really, 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 really bad storm. And he gets shipwrecked. And he honestly thinks he's going to die. The actual boat is torn to pieces, and he literally sits there for a moment and he tells God, if you save me, if you just save me, I promise I will do something great for you. I will work with you. I will do whatever you want me to do. Just get me out of here. And he spends 20 days at the bottom of this boat, which was wrecked apart, which was torn apart. And then finally he is saved. And he promises to give his life to God in that moment. So he begins to study the notion of theology and who God is. And he begins to take a very special interest, specifically in the character of Jesus Christ. Now what's very important to know is this, is that while studying, he almost had like 2 really, really good buddies. The first one, that is an acquaintance of his, is his best friend, who we know to be Saint Basil the Great. So they become really intimate friends. The other buddy of his that he ends up knowing while studying this notion of faith and philosophy and rhetoric is Flavius Claudius Julianus, who ends up becoming who? Emperor Julian the Apostate, who ends up what? Basically condemning and persecuting Christians. And we'll see why this is important and why they know each other. Later, St. Gregory becomes a teacher of rhetoric in Athens. Now, what do we know? We know that after he finishes studying at 361, at the age of 32, he is told, you got to go back home. You got to leave Athens. Why? Because your father needs you. What do you mean your father needs you? Well, his father happens to be the bishop of Nazianzus. Now, what do we know about this time in the mid-4th century? This dude by the name of Arius arises, and he starts causing major problems in the church, and he starts preaching these things that are absolutely false. And he starts saying things such as, the Son is less than the Father, and the Father and the Son are not equal. And he starts saying things like Jesus Christ is not actually God. Now this is causing major problems in the empire, because if you're saying that Jesus Christ isn't God, then who died on the cross? And if Jesus Christ isn't God, then how can you say that God became man? And how can you even call the Holy Virgin Mother Theotokos? How can you call her the mother of God? So Arius starts to cause some major problems. Now here's the problem. To the uneducated, it almost sounds normal. Why? Because the number one argument is there is Father, and traditionally you would say what? The Son is under the Father. And who falls in this trap? His father, the bishop of Nazianzus. And because he's falling into these traps, he needs somebody to be able to help control the people who are causing an uproar at this time. So he ends up helping his father teach against many of the heresies that are happening in his own town. Basil, at this point, who is his good friend, is so dedicated to the faith that he opens a monastery in Cappadocia. What we know about St. Gregory is, despite the fact that he was helping his father, he did not want to be in the public eye whatsoever. One thing you're going to discover about Gregory, this guy is so timid. He's so shy. He's the kind of person who just wants to seclude and be by himself all the time. He wants to be with God constantly. He does not want to be in the eye of the public whatsoever. So he longs for the monastic life. So at some point, what he ends up doing is that he ends up joining Basil in his monastery. After helping his father, he goes, you know what, I want to be a monk. So he joins his friend Basil. But eventually he ends up having to return back to help his father because, again, his father is not doing such a great job of controlling the city and taking care of the people and serving them and so on and so forth. He helps in defending the faith in times of conflict, even accusations against his father, because his father messed up so many times in preaching that there was accusations that were done against him. So his son Gregory literally had to defend him, and he served as a person who defended the faith even in the country of his own father. In 362, he publicly opposes Julian. Now Julian becomes the emperor. Remember, who did we say Julian was? Julian was one of the two that was friends with him while he was studying, right? Now at some point, Julian is constantly saying, what, Christians have to die? No one can offer incense or worship anyone but the emperor. Now you have to understand, in the 4th century, during that time of the Roman Empire, if you were emperor, you were considered a deity. So literally, some of the titles that we give to God today, such as the Son of God or the Son of Righteousness, and all of those titles, they were given to the emperor in the Roman Empire. So the emperor was considered to be a god. People would offer incense to the emperor. So Julian, being egotistical, ends up saying what? No, you cannot worship anybody but the emperor if you are part of the Roman Empire. So who decides that he's going to lash out at him? Gregory. So Gregory writes a whole series of letters, and he publicizes them, and because of his strength in rhetoric, he basically makes a mockery out of Julian. Julian gets absolutely irate. He can't handle it. So at some point he declares war against Gregory. Later what we discover is that Julian tries to persecute him, but he ends up dying in that very same year. How? It's not really noted, but we do know that the church believes that somehow, because of the fact that he had put St. Gregory in his mind to get rid of him, and God was not done with the work of St. Gregory, the man suddenly dies. Now, let's go back to his other friend for a second. Him and St. Basil end up creating this tag team duo that is unstoppable. Now you have to understand, this notion of Arianism is getting really bad in the empire. Really bad. What happens? In 325, there's a council in Nicaea. And we know the hero of that council happens to be St. Athanasius. But St. Athanasius at this point is being persecuted left and right, that he's being told you can no longer be the patriarch or the bishop of Alexandria. So he keeps getting exiled. They keep kicking him out of his own city. They keep telling him, if you don't leave Alexandria, we'll burn the churches down. We'll hurt your people. So he ends up going in exile 5 times. But while this is happening, there's riots happening over all the kingdom. Because people don't know who to believe anymore. Do I believe these bishops who are telling me that the Father and the Son are equal? Or do I believe these new people who have come out of nowhere that are ordained by all these pagan emperors that are teaching that the Son, Jesus Christ, is not equal to the Father? People are constantly confused, and this is causing a tremendous amount of problems. So these two arise on the scene. Basil and Gregory end up coming together and they say, you know what? We need to be able to do something about this. So what do? Seeing as how rhetoric was so important at that time, they literally would set up public debates. In the open squares, they would set up and call for people and say, anybody who wants to argue theology to theology, to be able to discuss the nature of God, to be able to discuss this idea of who Christ is, come, bring your arguments, and we'll go ahead and have a public debate. And one debate after another, they wipe the floor with all these people who try to convince others that the Father and the Son are not equal. And in many public and organized debates with Arian leaders, St. Basil and St. Gregory triumph. In 370, St. Basil is ordained the Bishop of Caesarea. Now, there's something you should know about St. Basil. He is nothing like his friend Gregory. St. Basil is outspoken. St. Basil, his tongue is like a sword. If he wants to, he will pierce right through. He's got absolutely no problems. This man is nothing like Gregory, who is very shy, soft-spoken, humble in his approach. No, St. Basil, if you say anything against God, I will make a mockery out of you. I will crucify you publicly. And this is the approach that St. Basil has. So he has character that is like, it's extremely strong what he has compared to his counterpart Gregory. Why is this important? Because in 372, St. Gregory is pressured by his father and his friend St. Basil to be ordained a bishop of this small city called Cesena. Now remember, what does St. Gregory actually want to do? He just wants to be a monk. He wants to be left alone. If you get ordained a bishop, you need to know that in that time, it's the death sentence. Why? Because you're guaranteed to be persecuted. You're guaranteed to have absolutely no time for yourself and God. You're constantly serving, constantly being put on the spot, constantly being threatened. And to him, all he wants to do is to become a monk. So he gets pressured by his father, who is a bishop, and his friend, who is now a bishop, to become the bishop of the small city called Sasima. And this is done against his own will. In that same year of 372, St. Gregory ends up having to go back to Nazianzus, the city of his father. His father gets so old and so ill that he ends up leaving his city behind, Sasima, to go back to Nazianzus and to help his father there. Now this causes a problem. I understand that you're close to your father, but you got a responsibility towards Sasima. You can't just pack up and leave and go to Nazianzus. So this is not pleasing to St. Basil. St. Basil helped in the ordination for the city of Sasima, and now Sasima is left orphaned all by herself with a whole bunch of priests. That's fine, but he ends up going to help his father. And then his father ends up dying, and the people turn to St. Gregory and tell him, well, you're going to take your father's place. And he refuses. He goes, no, I will not be called the Bishop of Nazianzus. That was my father. Later on, what we discover is that despite the fact that he said, don't give me the title, he did serve that city, arguably even more than his father did. In 375, he ends up saying, what? Everything seems to be under control. I've helped Nazianzus. I've helped Sasima. I'm going to the monastery. And he goes and lives 3 years in the monastery in the year 375. While all of this is happening, there is this new city by the name of Constantinople. Does anybody know who established Constantinople? It should be really easy. Constantine, right? Constantine, who was this righteous emperor, he decides to establish this new city called Constantinople, and his whole purpose is to create a new hub of the world, a new capital of the world, not just theologically, but philosophically, educationally, academically, economically. He wants Constantinople to be the new Rome, if you wish. So Constantinople is gaining a lot of power. And this is not pleasing to everyone. This is not pleasing to everyone. Because while the empire is pushing for Constantinople to become this great city, there are two other cities who traditionally have had very high esteem in the eyes of the world. Rome and Alexandria, right? But seeing as how Rome is a very important city, scripturally, not to mention the fact that this is where Peter and Paul both preached and helped establish the faith and were finally killed. So they say, you know what, fine, leave Rome where it's at, number one. But Alexandria, yeah, it's great, they'll understand, and they end up saying what? After Rome, let's plug in Constantinople as second in line, and we'll just push Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem down. Who freaks out? The Egyptians, right? Alexandria is like, no, what do you mean? We're number two, we're not number three. Like, you're lucky we accepted to be number two to begin with. Like, we're not going to be number three. And this is causing some major political arguments. Even within the bishops, people are not happy with this. So immediately you get this notion of what? There's this bitter aftertaste that exists between Alexandria and Constantinople. Keep that in mind because we're going to talk about it in just a second. At this point, there's a new emperor by the name of Theodosius. Now, Theodosius is a righteous man, and he loves Christianity. And he realizes that there's still a lot of problems that are happening right now within the cities, and not just because of Arianism. Now, this is in the late 4th century. Now, remember, when did we say was Nicaea? Nicaea was in 325, right? Here, we are talking about a little bit over 50 years later in 379. Theodosius becomes the emperor. Arianism is still hurting people, but now you have a new problem. It's not enough that you were trying to cause problems by saying that the Father and the Son are not equal. Now people are starting to attack the notion of the Holy Spirit and saying, okay, you know what, you want to believe the Father and the Son are the same? Okay, fine. But at the very least, let's admit, the Holy Spirit is nothing but their servant. The Holy Spirit is nothing but, if you wish, almost like their energy. But, you know, it's sort of like the little brother who just, you know, he takes care of everything else. We boss him around and everything's okay. And they start speaking of the Holy Spirit in a sense which is absolutely condescending. Now this is causing even more turmoil in the empire. So Theodosius, he decides, he says, well, if I'm going to be the emperor of this, we got to try to calm this down. So he declares that he wants a second council to happen very quickly. While he is the emperor, he decides and says, any of the true Orthodox bishops who were exiled, you're coming back to your place. All Arian bishops, get out. All Orthodox bishops, come back in your place. And before he dies, St. Basil does something that is a little bit, in the eyes of Gregory, it was a stab in the back. Because right before he dies, he makes sure that the emperor is aware that there is a very righteous man who is right now at the monastery who is actually a bishop by the name of Gregory. And he insists the emperor has to know that Gregory is one of the key people that you need to have on your side if you want to be able to do something right for the empire. So he throws that out right before he dies. In 379, he is convinced to move to Constantinople. Who is this St. Gregory? St. Gregory is forced. Basically, once again, it's as if the man has no say in anything he does. Okay? Get out of the monastery, we need you in Constantinople. So he ends up going to Constantinople. And he is given this small little home, and he turns his home into a church. And he begins to pray and teach and educate people about proper Orthodox theology from that little home. And that church was called Anastasia, basically meaning what, the Church of the Resurrection. Okay? Something very amazing happens, and the church starts to fill up almost instantaneously. People are attracted to this man who knows rhetoric, who knows the faith, who speaks beautifully, who is convinced in his faith, who is clearly a man who has seen God, and they are attracted to this. So the church gets full and becomes very popular very quickly. Now, who doesn't like this? The people who are against the faith, mainly the Arians. So what happens? On Easter Eve of 379, Easter Eve, a few bishops and priests are gathered together to be able to celebrate the feast of Easter and the resurrection at the Church of Anastasia, which is the home of St. Gregory, and there are attacks. And these attacks are performed by Arians, and they end up wounding St. Gregory and actually killing another bishop in the process of attacking the church. And you would think that that's just about enough drama for a guy who was once in the monastery and is forced to leave the monastery. He just wanted to be a monk. He's forced to be a bishop. He's tossed around from place to place. But no. Not is it only not enough for his church to be attacked, his home to be attacked, and for him to lose a bishop in the process. But in the meantime, there's this new person who arises on the scene. I'm telling you, these things should be made into movies. There is so much drama, it's phenomenal. A guy by the name of Maximus. Maximus, his story is very interesting. Maximus, again, wherever there's drama, there's Egyptians. Maximus is Egyptian. Okay? Maximus is a very righteous person. He defended the faith quite a bit, and he was actually exiled, and he ran, and he was persecuted. And at some point, he gets into... He's neither a bishop, nor priest, nor nothing. He's just a righteous person. Okay? At this point, what ends up happening with him is he gets to meet St. Gregory. And St. Gregory welcomes him with absolutely open arms. Absolutely open arms. But while this is happening, Gregory is actually sick. His health is failing him. Now remember what we said about the drama between Alexandria and Constantinople? Alright, well that drama is about to be exponentially put into place into the story. There's a few people from Alexandria, and some of them are bishops, who are basically saying what? Well, you know what? If Maximus is in Constantinople, and we can't really get rid of Constantinople, we might as well win Constantinople over. So what do? They end up going to Constantinople, and they literally convince Maximus that while St. Gregory is sick, we'll ordain you patriarch. We'll make you the patriarch of Constantinople, instead of Gregory, who is sick and who can't perform his roles. So Maximus, who, some people defend him by saying he really had no intention. Other people say, no, he was in on this from the very beginning. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, what ends up happening is that there is this secret gathering of people who falsely declare Maximus as the patriarch of Constantinople. Now Gregory gets better, and they tell him, guess what? Somebody just kind of took your spot. Now Gregory, being such a kind-hearted and gentle bishop, he basically says, I'm really okay with that. Like, I got no problems. I just don't want any beef. I don't want no drama. It's going to be perfectly fine. Like, I really have no problem with any of this. But that's not the way it goes down. You can't just say, it's okay, I'll walk away. You've got responsibilities. You're a bishop, right? Drama. Gregory ends up stepping down because he doesn't want any conflict. Now Theodosius, the emperor, hears about this, and he's about to lose his marbles. He can't believe what's happening. So what does he do? He clears the matter, makes Gregory the official patriarch of Constantinople, and after 40 years of being ruled by Arians, Constantinople, which was like an Arian spot for the longest time, finally, the emperor comes in and he goes, none of this, gets rid of Maximus, gets rid of the Arians, puts Gregory in his spot. Theodosius and Gregory end up working together and they say, we have to do something about what's happening in the empire, and all these people popping up and saying things about Christ not being equal to the Father and the Holy Spirit not being equal to the other two, and what are we going to do about this? So finally they decide and say, you know what, we have to have a second council. We had a first council in Nicaea, that was great. But that was over 50 years ago. At this point in time, it's the year 381, and they say we need a second council. And they organize the council in Constantinople, in the backyard of St. Gregory. So they call the council, and Gregory, at this point in time, he's leading sort of the conversation. He is the patriarch of Constantinople, right? Drama. He's talking and he's saying, welcome to Constantinople, we love you guys are great, and immediately, the tomatoes and the eggs start being thrown, and basically he's being told stuff like, you are not actually the patriarch or the bishop of Constantinople. And they find a loophole. And this is actually, it's not a loophole, it's an actual rule, it's a canon of the church. And people start to argue, and by the way, the Alexandrians are all over this, okay? The Egyptians are pumping fire, okay? They're saying what? When you were ordained a bishop, what were you ordained bishop over? What was the name of that little city you were ordained over? Sasima? Yeah. You're supposed to be bishop of Sasima. What are you doing in Constantinople? How is it that you're going to go against the canons of the church and be a patriarch or a bishop in two different places? A riot. Absolutely irrelevant. People are arguing and people are missing the point. We're gathered here to be able to talk about heretics. We're here to be able to find solutions for the church and the faith. And meanwhile, everybody deviates from the conversation. And everybody's talking about whether or not Gregory should be leading the conversation, and whether or not he should be the bishop of Constantinople. Now, Gregory being Gregory, what does he say? No, it's fine. I don't need to be the bishop of anything, really. But he doesn't just say it like that. And here you see the true character of St. Gregory. He puts himself out on the line in one of the most beautiful ways that you can possibly imagine. Because his position was not recognized by all those who were there, he does the following. He was physically exhausted, and his health was wavering because of everything that was happening and all the drama that was happening. So he says the following. Let me be as the prophet Jonah. Let me be as the prophet Jonah. I was responsible for the storm, but I would sacrifice myself for the salvation of the ship. Seize me and throw me. I was not happy when I ascended to the throne, and gladly would I descend from it. He is comparing what's happening in that moment at the council to exactly what happened to Jonah. If you remember the story of Jonah, while he was in the ship trying to escape from God, a storm broke out. And the people start to look around to see, why is this happening? Why is God so upset with us? And finally they find Jonah sleeping. And Jonah tells them, throw me over. I'm the cause of all this. If you throw me over, the storm will cease. And that's exactly what happened. They threw Jonah over, and the storm ceased, and the big fish swallowed Jonah. And here St. Gregory is comparing himself to that. He goes, I am the cause of the storm. Indirectly saying, what you guys are missing the point. This is not what we gathered for. We didn't gather to discuss me. We shouldn't be having this storm around us. We're trying to only put out the fire of the notion of Arianism and the problems of those who are combating against the Holy Spirit. Let's not miss the point. And he gives this beautiful oration. And he addresses all of his brothers, the bishops. And in that moment, after he addresses them, the bishops, he basically asked for them to relieve him from his office, and they all honored him in that moment and allowed him to leave. And they allowed him to step down. And he gained that respect in front of the entire Christian world in that moment. Now this is Saint Gregory, a person who was not looking for his rank, a person who was not running after honor, but on the contrary, his sole focus was what? Can we defend the church and her teachings? As for the end of his life, Gregory resumes his position as the bishop of Nazianzus. He spent the next year again fighting the local heretics. By the end of 383, his health was so feeble that he ended up saying, I cannot no longer deal with all the issues of the bishopric. So Gregory established Eulalius as a bishop after him, and after 6 years of retirement, he finally died on January 25th in 390. This is the life of Gregory. And this is the life of a saint that we consider to be not just a patristic father, but a theologian. And how is it that the church discerns to see who is worthy of being called a theologian, and who is worthy to be called basically a father of the church or a patristic father, and so on and so forth? Well, when you read what these people have to say, you come to some realization that these people are speaking of something very tangible. Their poetry and the way that they write about it is something that they have truly experienced and seen. And I would like to share with you guys a few things that St. Gregory wrote. I'm going to share with you 3 of his sayings. St. Gregory says the following: it is better to choose a commendable war than peace which separates from God. It is better to choose a commendable war than peace which will separate from God. The faith which I was taught by the Holy Fathers, which I taught at all times, without adjusting according to the times, this faith I will never stop teaching. I was born with it, and I live by it. This is St. Gregory. St. Gregory also says the following: we needed an incarnate God, a God put to death, that we might live. We were put to death together with him, that we might be cleansed. We rose again with him because we were put to death with him. We were glorified with him because we rose again with him. When you actually pay attention to the words of St. Gregory in the liturgy, the Gregorian liturgy that the Coptic Orthodox Church prays, you will notice that he speaks of God in ways that are extremely personal. As a matter of fact, when you read his liturgy speaks directly to the Son, to Christ himself. And he addresses his entire liturgy in that format. And you will notice that when he does that, it's as if he knows him personally. It's as if he has experienced him. And I am telling you, forget just trying to pay attention to the screen while Abuna is praying. If you have Coptic Reader, and you have a chance, go read just a few paragraphs of the institution narrative, or basically when Abuna blesses the mystery during that holy period of the liturgy. Go read those few passages, clear-mindedly, not during the craziness of the Eid. Just go ahead and read them, and you will see for yourself. You can learn so much about God simply from the liturgy of St. Gregory. The last quote that I will share with you is the following: as a fish cannot swim without water, and as a bird cannot fly without air, so a Christian cannot advance a single step without Christ. To him be the glory now and forever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen.